Today we're talking about two broad varieties of the pea plant, Pisum sativum. Broadly speaking, you can think of these categories as garden peas and field peas. The garden pea plant varieties tend to produce wrinkled peas, and the field pea plant varieties tend to produce round peas. Wrinkled peas are also typically sweet tasting, while the round pea plant varieties are typically starchy tasting. So why is there this difference in the shape and the taste of the peas when we're thinking about the garden pea plants versus the field pea plants? Anytime we're talking about a trait that differs from one individual to the next, or one population to the next, or one subspecies or species to the next, there's often a genetic difference between whatever two individuals or populations or subspecies or species that we're comparing. All right, a genetic difference. The pea plant has about 45,000 genes. So how would we know where we're supposed to look for this supposed genetic difference? Which of those 45,000 genes is responsible for the round, starchy characteristic versus the wrinkled, sweet characteristic? And can it even be a single gene that controls two different things like that? Well, in this video, we're going to look at the cell biology involved in making starch and sugar in pea plants like Pisum sativum to see if that can give us some clues regarding the genetic basis behind round and wrinkled peas. All right, let's start with what we know. The first thing we know is that there seems to be a difference between round and wrinkled peas with respect to how they taste. Wrinkled peas taste sweeter, so they must have a higher sugar or sucrose content when compared to round peas. Round peas taste starchier, so they must have a higher starch content when compared to wrinkled peas. Most people have a pretty good idea what sucrose is. It's the molecule that makes up table sugar. But what's starch? All right, starch is just a sugar polymer. Poly means many, and mer means units. So a sugar polymer is just a long chain of sugar molecules. In this case, it's the sugar molecule glucose. In plants, glucose is a molecule that's derived from the process of photosynthesis. Let's take a quick detour. How do plants make glucose? In photosynthesis, chlorophyll molecules in the chloroplast intercept photons of light from the sun, or really from any light source. Those photons kick off a series of reactions that ultimately excite or energize electrons that contribute to the manufacturing of a molecule called NADPH, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Those high-energy excited electrons from NADPH help to drive a process called the Calvin cycle. That's where plants take in CO2, or carbon dioxide, and build a molecule called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P. Two molecules of this G3P can be combined in a process called gluconeogenesis and produce glucose. Glucose is great. It can be converted into a long-term energy storage molecule like starch in plants or like fats in animals. Or it can get broken down in a process called glycolysis and then get further processed in the mitochondria to produce ATP. ATP is an amazing molecule. It can catalyze all kinds of cellular reactions and do all sorts of other things in the cell, but I'm getting a little bit carried away. Let's get back on track. If round peas are starchy, then let's take a closer look at the pathway that gets us from glucose to starch. It might give us a clue as to what's going on in wrinkled peas that makes them less starchy and more sugary. All right, let's start with G3P. Remember, plants ultimately take in CO2 and use it to build G3P. Here we go. Buckle up. If you combine two molecules of G3P, the first thing that you make is something called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate can get converted into a molecule called fructose 6-phosphate, which can then get converted into a molecule called glucose 6-phosphate. phosphate. Just a quick shift of the phosphate group and glucose 6-phosphate can be converted into glucose 1-phosphate. A glucose 1-phosphate molecule can combine with another glucose 1-phosphate molecule to form something called ADP glucose. Finally, these molecules of ADP glucose can sort of link up to form a starch molecule called amylose, or simple starch. Amylose is essentially just a long chain of glucose molecules. It's pretty stable, and it's a really effective way for plants to store chemical energy. Amylose, however, can interact with a molecule called the starch branching enzyme, or SBE1, to form branched or complex starch. It's called amylopectin. So now that we know this, let's take a look at the sugar and the starch that's found in round and wrinkled peas. In a round pea, when it's dried out, about 47% of the weight comes from starch. Of that starch, about 40% is the simple starch, amylose, whereas 60% is the complex starch, amylopectin. Only about 6% of the weight in round peas comes from the sugar sucrose. The rest of the weight in round peas would come from things like lipids, proteins, and other molecules. In wrinkled peas, when they're dried out, only about 35% of their weight comes from starch. Of that, nearly 70% is the simple starch amylose, whereas only 30% is the complex starch amylopectin. For wrinkled peas, nearly 12% of their total weight comes from the sugar sucrose, and the rest of the weight comes from other molecules like lipids and proteins. This means that instead of building lots of amylopectin, wrinkled pea plants are ultimately converting their glucose and fructose into sucrose. So evidently there seems to be some kind of problem with the starch branching enzyme, SBE1, that prevents wrinkled peas from generating a high quantity of complex starch. So now we know why some peas are sweet and why others are starchy. But what does this have to do with being wrinkled or being round? The shape of the peas has to be controlled by a different process, right? Actually, no, it's all part of the same process. You see, in sweet peas, the high concentration of sugars leads to lots of osmosis, or water movement into the pea seed cells. Sugars like glucose or fructose or sucrose are polar, and polar molecules facilitate osmosis. Because of this, the sweet peas have lots of water in them, and when they dry out, they lose that water and end up wrinkling. Starchy peas, on the other hand, they have lots of that branched starch and a lot less sucrose. The branched starch, amylopectin, it's really not that polar. It's not soluble in water either. So ultimately, it doesn't facilitate very much osmosis. So the starchy peas don't have that high water content like the sweet peas do. Instead, they're filled with that branched starch. So when they dry out, they don't have as much water to lose, and they end up keeping their smooth, round shape. So now you know why wrinkled peas are sweet and why they wrinkle. In the genetics video of this series, we'll take a deeper look at the genetics of this system, and we'll explore how the starch branching enzyme gene, SBE1, differs between round and wrinkled peas. So be sure to check it out. You can find that video on our Evo-Ed website or on the links down below in the description. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.